So, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Samantha Hewitt. I am a senior marketing manager here at Telgorithm. I'll be moderating today's live Q&A. Here to lead this conversation and guide us through the questions around A2P 10DLC registration and beyond is industry leader and Telgorithm CEO and co-founder Aaron Alter. Hi, Aaron. Welcome.
Hey, Samantha, thanks for taking the time to put this all together. I know a lot of work go into these, and it's much appreciated. And secondly, thanks to everyone here for attending today. Obviously, one of the things we do here at Telgorithm, which many may have seen, is we try to provide a lot of education and transparency, something that's we believe is majorly lacking in the industry. And I'm thankful for everyone that's attended today, and I'm hoping that I'm successful at answering your questions in the best that I can.
Awesome, Aaron. Thank you. I'm sure you will be. For anyone who hasn't gotten the chance to meet you, could you give us a brief intro on, your background and what you do at Telgorithm?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the telecommunications industry for close to 20 years now. It's crazy to say that, spanning wireless, VoIP technologies. And I would say the last 10 years of my career have been more on the SaaS side of things, cloud communications, particularly in vertical SaaS. I served as the head of telecommunications at a vertical SaaS CRM known as Service Titan. I also served as the director of telecommunications at another company called SignalWire. And a lot of what I'm passionate about, as I just alluded to, is the transparency or the lack of transparency that exists in the overall cloud communication industry in general. And we founded Telgorithm not only to provide that, but to also provide tech that accounts for that and cares for that and cares for the customer bottom line, not only on a cheaper cost per message, but actually making sure that you're set up from day one and making sure your messages get delivered by providing tech that does that as well. And I'm excited to touch on some of those points today.
Cool. That's perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So, as far as today goes, we have a super light agenda just to kind of help get us started. This will include a little bit of background info to sort of set the scene and let us know where we're at in the industry right now and what the heck is going on, why we're here to talk. Um, and then we'll go into some of the most common questions that we've been receiving. We think they'll speak to a lot of the participants today. To submit your own questions, you can use the Q&A tab below on your Zoom window, or you can use the chat. Those will be going directly to your moderators here. They can be anonymous, or you can submit them with your name. We do ask that you provide as much information as you can as possible, including maybe your specific company messaging use case, just so that Aaron is able to provide as much value, specific value to you as possible. If we are unable to get to your question today, please know that we will reach out directly after the Q&A, so no worries, but we will do our best. Okay, so to set the scene, let's start at the top, Aaron. However you want to take this, what is A2P messaging and why is it important? Wherever you want to go with that.
Sure. So there's a number of ways that we can go about this, but I think of recent, one of the things I'll point out from a fundamental standpoint, and I think there's a lot of misconception around this, is that it's about compliance, right? This whole A2P thing is about enforcing compliance, and compliance is complex in and of itself. But actually, the reality of it is that A2P, or application to person messaging, or business to consumer messaging, is actually really not about compliance, because the prior path, the only path that existed for messaging until A2P was P2P, or person to person messaging. And you were still required to be compliant, right? You're still required to follow SHAFT, to follow TCPA guidelines, to follow network operator rules of and modes of conduct. So what's really changed between P2P, or person to person protocol, and A2P? What is the difference? Why was there a need for the network operators to create a new path called A2P? If it was just compliance, they could have just made it that and we'll get to that today, that you have to register on P2P. What's this A2P? And the way that I like to, and it's important to understand it in this way, is that P2P, when P2P was created in the 90s, or person to person, it was me text messaging you by hand. And so not a lot of throughputs, being the key word here, were needed. And so the network operators essentially set a throughput max of 60 messages per number. At the time when this protocol was created back in the 90s, there was no internet, there was no cloud communication like we have it today, and therefore not a lot of throughput is needed. And in general, not a lot of throughput is needed for a person-to-person actual messaging communication. And so because there hadn't been really an official sanctioned path for businesses to communicate with their consumers properly, which typically require a lot more throughput, right? If I want to message 1 million customers that maybe I'm an electric or utility company and I have 1 million subscribers and there's a power outage, 60 messages in a minute on a phone number is just not going to work out, right? So I had to kind of get creative as a business until now to try to figure out how I can reach customers on a text messaging path, which is very valuable even till today. And that was not the right mode of things. And hence the network operators needed and saw a need with the advent of technology and the need for legitimate businesses to communicate properly with its consumers to then create this new path that would boast much higher throughputs. Where the compliance layer comes into this is obviously, some weird kind of things were going on over time on P2P. People were snowshoeing, people, were rotating numbers. A lot of people were, violating the compliance on the P2P layer. Now that they were creating a new protocol for legitimate businesses, they wanted to make sure that as the network operators, that is, roll out their A2P or this higher throughput path for business communication, that the nefarious activity that was taking place over time on P2P wouldn't just simply migrate over to A2P, since I don't have to procure hundreds of thousands of numbers to send at the throughput rates that I need. And hence they partnered up with, and we'll talk about it today, with this entity, which is a subsidiary of a larger company, Calera, known as the Campaign Registry, to kind of become a reputation authority. And the network operators chose this authority as they rolled out their A2P messaging protocol to essentially make sure now we're starting off with a new path, a new proper protocol for legitimate business communication. Let's make sure that this is a clean path. And that's where the compliance layer comes in. So essentially, whereas in the past, you might have gotten on P2P just by default without having to follow compliance, which led to kind of, weird things going on. This is now, since there's a net new protocol, net new system, let's make sure it's clean up front. But the reason, again, I just want to highlight this point because there's a lot of confusion here. A2P is not about compliance. It's about businesses properly communicating with their customer, and particularly needing higher throughput. As an example, one last point I'll mention on this one is low volume campaign versus, a dedicated campaign. What's the difference? There's no difference on compliance. You still have to be compliant. Just one gives you higher throughput and one gives you lower throughput. And fundamentally, it's also important to understand this when choosing a provider that will properly support you and your business as you navigate and purchase your way into getting these higher throughputs that are needed for your business.
That's a
So
great
that's
it's a great kickoff. One thing I want to call out is throughput. We've also heard it be called rate limit. And I just want to make sure that everyone makes the correlation that throughput is the same as a rate limit.
correct. Rate limiting throughputs, essentially in a nutshell, a simplified way of putting it is how fast I can send a given amount of messages to my consumers. So there's certain allotments that are given. And by the way, these allotments are not the same for all network operators. And it's also important to understand that, but correct, there's different things that people call it terms. Rate limiting is obviously a common term use, and good for calling that out.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay, so let's move into 10DLC specifically. Give us the lowdown on 10DLC at a high level.
Yeah, so again, as I was mentioning earlier, the idea here is, first of all, what is a 10DLC? And as to the point I mentioned earlier, what does 10DLC stand for? A 10-digit long code. That's what the acronym, which this industry has a lot of, stands for. 10-digit long code. Well, on P2P, your local numbers were 10 digits and they were a long code. So hence 10-digit long code, right? But 10DLC, it's really, the real and right term is A2P 10DLC or P2P 10DLC, right? It's either I'm using person to person, this local 10-digit number for person to person, or I'm using A2P 10DLC. I'm using this 10-digit local number for business to consumer communication. It's typically became a term now more widely used, more often than not, to refer to A2P, since no one really referred to it for the most part in the way that it's being referred to now. But really, when folks are referring to 10DLC, 10-digit long code messaging, they're referring to this new protocol and new layer, which is now being added since for a while now. Verizon started in February of 2020. They rolled out their A2P, or business to consumer path. And then they followed on by T-Mobile and AT&T in April of 2021, I believe. So that's essentially where this name and where some of that nuance is over here on the 10DLC actual acronym and naming of things.
Perfect. And then a natural progression for this conversation would go into TCR, or the campaign registration for 10DLC messaging.
Yeah, so again, this, as I mentioned just a minute earlier, the campaign registry is this reputation authority that was, got into contract with, or essentially the network operators chose as businesses navigate, which is now required. It's not optional. They didn't do all this for optionality, right? By default, if you were a business using text until now, A2P did not exist. So by default, you were on a officially really a non-sanctioned path for business communication. And that was kind of okay officially, because they couldn't expect any more than that since there was no other path. Now there is another path, and a clean path to do it. So the idea here is, as network operators launched that higher throughput byway on their networks, they wanted a reputation authority to kind of make sure this is a clean ecosystem, and hence they partnered with the campaign registry. Today, all the main four are partnered there. You're seeing some additional carriers join, or just in the last month, Clear Sky and another network operator joined as well. And this will expand actually into Canada as well, and beyond North America eventually. It'll even potentially expand even into the toll-free side of things, which is it's a whole different discussion. But essentially, they were chosen, this reputation authority, subsidiary of Calera, was chosen to oversee the reputation and compliance of businesses migrating and navigating and migrating essentially onto this new business to consumer path as the network operators have rolled it out. And there are a lot of nuances here, some of which I'm sure folks are wondering about, we'll ask about today, and happy to answer those.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So that wraps up our intro, I would say. That gives us some nice foundation to work off of. We're going to start with some of these top of mind questions that we pulled together. Like I mentioned before, we've been getting a lot of questions from our customers. So we want to address those in bulk here. If you would like to ask your own question, please hit up our Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can type them in there anonymously, or with your name. Just provide as much context as you can, such as your messaging use case, so that we can answer with as much value as possible. Okay, Aaron, so let's start at the top. Obviously, I think everyone here knows that registration is now mandatory across the board with TCR. Share, whatever you would like to about that, about, why that is. But most importantly, what are the benefits of actually being registered?
Great question. So first of all, what's the definition of mandatory? What does that mean? Is, someone holding a gun to my head, be comedic about it, and making sure, hey, you must register, right? So really, the way I think about this is there's really three levers that have been pulled by the network operators since this started to roll out. One was pass-through fees. So every time you send a text message, there is the carrier that you're sending the message to charges a pass-through fee for that message. So one of the levers they've been using is hiring this fee for unregistered traffic, right? So if you choose to be unregistered, you will simply pay more money. And actually today it's crazy already, but as of June 1st, AT&T and T-Mobile have just announced, it'll be a penny, this is crazy, but a penny to send an unregistered message. So, right, we talk about mandatory, what are the levers here? So one is carrier pass-through fees. The other one is filtering, right? Because P2P, the only path that existed person to person until now, became such a wild west, or this kind of combat between the network operators and cloud providers in some ways enabling it, right? People snowshoeing, people rotating numbers. I'm going to try to see how I can get around this one and monitoring opt-out rates. What's this percent? What's that percent? Right? So what ended up happening is legitimate businesses that were on that old path got caught in the middle, and legitimate messages would end up getting flagged and not getting through. And so therefore, one of the paths that they got to kind of tighten this up was, right, to incentivize folks to move from P2P to A2P is tightening up the filters, so much so that even if it's a true legitimate use case with true legitimate content with low opt-out rates, you would still eventually, become totally blocked. Now, I'll actually point out, there have been recently some providers, one in particular, I won't mention the name today, but I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of this, announced a cutoff of March 31st. Others have announced, hey, there's no cutoff, but if you don't register today, we can't guarantee your messages, period. And I will tell you that really at the end, what's going on in the back is there's essentially just a handful of aggregators. So while there's many cloud communication providers, there's only a handful of actual aggregators that send your messages to the network operators. Aggregators, or the DCA, another acronym, Direct Connect Aggregator, are the companies that actually have the binds built directly with T-Mobile and AT&T that actually send the message directly into their network. Many providers you might have heard of today are actually not that. They're leveraging a DCA in the background. So it's really a system and a process where the network operators are pressuring the DCAs further to cut the spigot on non-registered traffic, because now that there is a path, you have a path where to go to properly send those messages. And so one of the other levers they're pulling is tightening up the filtering. So let's imagine this come June 1st, even until today, don't wait to June 1st, because it takes time to register. Imagine you're going to pay 1 penny per message on top of your provider's normal message fee. On top of that, your message may not even get delivered. And by the way, if it doesn't get delivered, you will still pay for that message. So you might pay 1 penny pass-throughs plus the limit your provider's charging to get a message that's not even delivered. It just, no matter how you slice and dice it, whether it be from a service perspective or from a business sense, it's basically lunacy not to work on a path if you're going to remain using local phone numbers to message to your business, to figure out a path to get into this ecosystem, figure that out and do it in the right way and do it today. And this has nothing to do with Telgorithm in general, because there will come a time, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's in 3 weeks or 2 months, it's kind of besides the point. And that's the third layer, the actual saying, hey, we're going to completely cut you off. Some have said it, by the way, even aggregators said it, and then they pulled it back. They said it and pulled it back. Their goal is, I could tell you in speaking with them directly, we have direct relationships with them, is they don't want to cut anyone off. And that's the reason you moved. It's more of, hey, we're trying to be light about this. So the main point here is, if you really want to continue using local numbers to text message your consumers properly, you need to be working on a plan and a path to become registered. And believe it or not, if you do the research, and we put a lot of content online about this, you can automate that process and make it fairly easy and streamline this process for your customers in an easy way for them to get going fairly quickly. And the positive about it is, and we see this in day-to-day, of course, there are exceptions to that rule, like there is with anything else, but we see tremendous deliverability rates that were unheard of ever in P2P. So I will tell you factually, this is not my opinion, it's fact. If you register and you do things in a proper way, you will experience deliverability like you've never seen before, like shocking levels of deliverability.
Awesome. That's a great benefit right there. Um, let's see. We did actually get a question. I'm going to interrupt our list for a question on brand vetting scores. So here's the question in full. How do we increase the brand vetting score if it's low for any brand? Also, does a brand vetting score vary with the traffic for that particular campaign? For example, brand vetting score is 90 for brand A, but in between their traffic, they mix in some phishing, so the vetting score reduces, or does it remain at 90?
Yeah, I'll take a more of a general approach to this question. Of course, anyone that has specific situations, please reach out to us. But I'm going to take I'll take the general question here, and that is, the way I hear it is, what is a trust score, and how does it work, and how does it relate to my throughput? So let's actually take even a further step back. As you know, A2P 10ELC rolled out, there were some changes in this area. And early on, there was this concept of a trust score given by the actual campaign registry itself under a brand. They actually sunset that. So the registry itself today does not provide any score at all. I'll get to where score still exists in a second. I just want to make it clear, the campaign registry itself does not allocate a trust score at all. There's just vetted and verified today. That simply means when you register a brand, at minimal, you are required to provide a tax ID for that brand, that entity, and its legal name. And the TCR, the campaign registry, does it's an automated, they do a background check just for that. They don't check anything else. When you submit a brand today directly to the registry, there's only one thing they're looking for. That is that the tax ID that you put in matches the entity type and matches the legal name that's on file with, the IRS or the government that you're using when you're selecting that. If that matches, you become vetted and verified, and then you could start sending messages. But what's also interesting about that, and this is for any company, regardless of anything, by default, you are put into the lowest tier and class on AT&T T-Mobile collectively. So you're by default put into this lowest class. I believe, and we could share this with you when we have this information on our website, but I believe it's 2,000 messages a day on T-Mobile is the lowest class possible, which you are defaulted in by default. And for AT&T, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's 75 TPM or 75 texts per minute. That's the lowest class that you will be automatically put into by default, right? Now, where does a trust score come in today? And does that even still exist? So obviously, as we mentioned earlier, business or A2P messaging, business to consumer messaging path is about being able to properly and have a timely way to communicate with your consumers. So what if 2,000 messages a day, which is, by the way, just a T-Mobile of all its collective campaigns, is not enough for your business, for your million users that you need to communicate with for some emergency, or even if it's for, marketing on Black Friday. So the campaign registry created a path for this to exceed, to higher those limits. And what they did is they partnered with 3 vetting partners. And I'll actually caveat this. There's a newer term today, which we should talk about today. I'm sure someone's going to ask me about it. There's something called DCA vetting today, which has caused a lot of delays in the registration process. The reason I'm mentioning this here is that that is a separate thing from what I'm talking about. And there's a lot of folks that are mixing the two up. There's a separate thing, we'll discuss it at some point today, called DCA vetting. That has nothing to do with throughputs. We'll parking lot that one for now. But assuming you want to get higher throughputs, the campaign registry partnered with 3 external vetting partners. One is WMC Global, one is Aegis Mobile, and one is campaignverified.org. So Aegis and WMC, they're very, very similar. You could try one or the other. I haven't seen much difference between them. When you, they actually, because of their partnerships with the registry, although you can go to these vendors directly on their website to get an added, or to try to go through what's called an added vetting, where they do a little bit of a more advanced background check, not just check the tax ID and the legal name matches. They're going to check more information about your brand. Maybe they'll check the website, how long you've been in business. They might pull some other things. They don't give a lot, obviously, for obvious reasons. It's private how they actually run their scores and what determines what's called a risk score, RISQ. But basically, when you enable go to one of these external partners of the registry, you could submit a request. I believe it's $40 typically for a regular external vet. Regardless of outcome, you pay a $40 one-time fee, and they run this additional, more advanced background check. And there's a possibility that you will get a higher throughput. If your business is legitimate, you will likely get a higher throughput. Now, there's different scoring levels, which then match up to higher throughputs, right? If you get 100, your throughput, I think, is between 80 and 100 on AT&T T-Mobile collectively. You get to their highest tier in the brackets, which are, I think it's 4,500 TPM today for SMS on AT&T, and it's 200,000 messages a day on T-Mobile. you can get all the way up to those higher buckets potentially. So what the campaign registry did initially, it wasn't like this. Initially, you'd have to go to one of these vetting partners, do the external vetting there. If it was approved, they would give you a token or a key. You would then take this token and import it in your campaign registry account or give it to your provider to import under that brand, which would then hire the score and then hence hire the throughput rates that would then be allocated because of that higher rate in score if there was one given, hence higher throughputs. I'll also add, what if 200,000 messages a day to T-Mobile is not enough? What if 4,500 TPM for SMS to AT&T is not enough? Well, both of those have an option to file what's called a SBR, or another acronym, Special Business Review, where you could technically get, if you qualify for it, and if you have the right use case for that, you could get unlimited. I mean, you can go get rates that are even beyond what you would even get in a short code if you have the right use case for that setup. So it's not necessarily there. It's more of the default is 2,000 messages a day, to T-Mobile and 75 TPM to AT&T. Then you have all this option for external vetting, which can get you to 4,500 AT&T, T-Mobile 2,000. If you want to go even further than that, you can go this SBR out and go, sky's the limit from that point there. And that's essentially how it works out. We can share post this, actually the campaign registry itself. And this is, again, kind of what I was alluding to earlier. You could actually see this information yourself directly on the campaign registry site. If you go under their FAQ section, they have a few pieces of collateral there. You could download one of them. I believe it's slides 13 and 14 that literally show you exactly what a trust score amounts to and what throughput. So there's no guesswork here. You know exactly how the network operators are going about it. There's even a diagram there. I think it's on the third slide in that deck that actually shows you the whole entire process of vetting and how the network operators think about it and how that's gone about in general. But that's essentially the breakdown there. So again, the default is low in general. There's one exception I'll actually mention here, and that's if you have a brand that's on the Russell 3000, by default, that automatically go to the highest tier. That's the only exception to that rule. But assuming most of your brands are not in the Russell 3000, it would go the path that I just mentioned here. Great question.
Awesome, Aaron. Thank you. That was great. Okay, let's see what else we've got. So I think that this question is around campaign vetting times. I'm not entirely sure. Here's the question, and maybe you can interpret it. So the question is there a shortcut if the number of messages is below X amount per month and the message is the exact same all across the board? So like the content is the same for an appointment reminder or something like that. What do you make of that?
Is there a shortcut for getting an approval for the campaign? Is that the question?
I'm not exactly sure what the shortcut is referring to, but that might be one interpretation. Is there any other that you might have?
So we could talk about campaign approval times, as I was just alluding to earlier there.
Sure.
But it could be this was referring to something else as well.
Okay.
And we'll touch on that. Actually, it's in the third bullet here, sole proprietor conversation. So I'll pick one. I'll pick the vetting one for now. So again, anyone that's listening, this one will be about vetting times and what's going on and what is DCA vetting. So everything I'm about to tell you, again, I know I'm wearing a Telgorithm hat. I'm a founder of Telgorithm. What I'm about to tell you, I'll preface, has nothing to do with Telgorithm. This is straight fact as to what is going on with additional vetting times. And one of the things I like to tell folks is before you could solve a problem, understand the root cause of the problem. So many of you have seen recently, whatever provider you're using, this new thing called DCA vetting or direct connect aggregator vetting. They even charge a $15 fee, which is mandatory for this. And by the way, if you get a rejected campaign, rejected 3 times, you'll pay $45. So it's important to make sure, that's a whole separate discussion, how to make sure your campaign will get approved the first time. But what is this vetting fee? What is the vetting altogether? Where did it come from? So as I mentioned at the top of this, the whole idea of A2P and the reason the campaign registry exists was to make sure that this new ecosystem, as it would roll out, would be a clean path, a clean environment for businesses. And therefore, they wanted to initially make this very easy for businesses to get going. They didn't want to set all these barriers here. So they created RESTful APIs. There's a portal that actually the registry has. And whether your vendor is using them or not, they've created some process around that. And they wanted to make it easier. And actually, if you rewind the clock 2 years, campaign approvals literally took seconds. I repeat, campaigns full approval process took seconds. And the reason is the whole process was fully automated. And this all changed essentially in the beginning of last year. Unfortunately, some folks in shaft violation industry, particularly cannabis community, decided to take a crack at trying to go onto this new A2P path. And they ended up, it's not clear exactly where they went about doing it, but they went and somehow registered actual traffic on A2P, got brands, got campaigns going, and started to send actual cannabis shaft violation traffic to end users. And T-Mobile, who everyone here that's joined likely knows has been the toughest, and there are reasons why they're the toughest based on how a lot of this came about, which is a discussion potentially for a different time. But T-Mobile started to get complaints in about April or May of last year from their end users saying, hey, I'm still receiving, I didn't opt in, which is besides the point, I'm receiving text messages from cannabis related companies. And T-Mobile got wind of this and they started to search, wait a second, this is coming from a registered number with a registered brand and campaign ID. How is this possible? So they started to look at, well, which DCA is this coming from? And as I mentioned earlier, there are only a handful of DCAs that actually exist. And they found one in particular. For today's Q&A, I will not mention their name, but if you do any sort of Googling or any little research, you'll figure it out for yourself. They're literally the second to largest or the largest, however you want to put it. The second to largest will say direct connect aggregator in North America was essentially the one that this traffic was filtering or going through. T-Mobile went to this DCA in last June and said, well, what's happening here? What's going on? And essentially they told them that going forward, we can't automate everything. So you now have to, going forward for the time being, you will have to, what was automated, would update into T-Mobile's SDG platform, which is their campaign registry platform. What was now automated between DCA and T-Mobile now has to have a manual process. So manual, as people know, manual means a person, right? People cost money to sit there and sift through and look through the content of a campaign that's submitted, the website, the URL, and all that information to make sure it's actual clean versus an automation or just letting it through. And so hence last summer is actually, many folks weren't aware of it, but last summer is when many of the providers started to announce a $15 fee. But that's where the fee came from, right? Manual people vetting costs money. Unfortunately, they sent it back downstream. That's unfortunate. And hopefully it'll go away after a period of time. It's not clear exactly when, but that's why there is now manual vetting. So manual vetting has a cost, but also takes more time. So folks might be wondering, well, that still doesn't answer the question. I noticed the delays have really gotten crazy, particularly over the last couple of months, not last summer. Well, that's exactly right, because last summer, folks were still trying to avoid getting an A2P, even innocently, right? They weren't aware of what it was. The pass-through fees weren't as high, the filtering wasn't, and no vendors announced actual straight cutoff dates. Well, so therefore, even though things were being done manually and what took a few seconds, a year earlier was now taking about 24 to 48 hours, still kind of okay. But where things got a little bit crazy is when the top two messaging providers announced in January of this year. January 23rd was one of them that said, if you don't register going forward, we cannot guarantee your traffic. And then another vendor announced a March 31st cutoff date. And what that caused is a massive influx into the amount of campaigns being created, right? Which are now ultimately, these two main providers are actually using the same DCA. And now you start to get an overload, right? People manually processing, maybe they have a 50x overload for what's happening, what happened last summer, not as many campaigns going through. Now there's an overload, everyone's trying to get registered for whatever reason, want to become compliant like we discussed. But now because of these cutoffs and because those levers are being pushed further, now you're seeing an overwhelming amount of campaigns coming into one place, causing a massive bottleneck. And that's why since January, up until very recently, You're noticing these massive times that went from, 2 days to a week. In some cases, now we're hearing 6 to 8 weeks, which is absolutely insane. It's 100% true. It's insane. So that's the root cause of these vetting delays. And again, just to clarify here, DCA vetting has nothing to do with throughputs, like we were discussing before. Today, in order to get a campaign, but this actually never changed, it was just automated in the past. Your campaign has to become what's called DCA elected yes, or the aggregator that's going to ultimately be used in chain has to approve each and every single campaign. That is a requirement just to become registered, nothing to do with throughput. That is a separate than the external vettings to higher throughput, which is a whole separate thing. So this is a requirement that is in place. And that's why folks are experiencing that delay. I will point out, and this is, I'll caveat here, this is a Telgorithm thing, because of our relationships and because of the trust and technologies we have built, not just waking up right now to this, but have been in this for a while now. And we're very close with the registry. Matter of fact, I interviewed the vice president of the campaign registry late last year. You guys should check that out. But because we've built that trust, we've gotten allotments to kind of what I call TCA pre-screen. So it still won't take 5 seconds with Telgorithm, but we can get a campaign approval, say in 3 to 5 days. It might bump up to a week typically, because again, it's still going to an overloaded place, but it does take some sort of priority since they know our CNP ID, they know who we are, they know what we're about. It does take quicker. It may get a little bit lengthened before it all ends, but for right now, our average time, I would say, is 3 to 5 business days. And I just don't say that. I always say, hey, make us prove it. Anyone here that's a CSP can easily go into their CSP account, create a campaign under a brand, and elect us in the dropdown. Telgorithm Inc. is a connectivity partner, no harm, no foul. You don't have to sign anything with Telgorithm. You could actually see, let us know about it, and you'll see actually how fast it takes for us to get your campaign approved. So you could actually try it for yourself and see if that works for you. But I will say, while it's extended to 3 to 5 days, it may go up to a week for us. I could tell you with the demand on some of the other massive vendors, it's taking, from what we hear, in some cases up to 8 weeks. And then imagine you get a rejection on a campaign after 4 weeks and you're even more frustrated. We're very on top of the campaigns that are going through ourselves. We sift through some of them ourselves and without any delay very quickly to make sure that we'll inform you about what you need to be doing for your use case to make sure it'll get approved the first time. You don't have to worry about a rejection. But essentially, that's what the whole idea of this DCA vetting fee comes from. I do believe, and this is just my thoughts, just based on the industry and knowing some folks there, I do believe that this will go away over some period of time when things, start to either that we're over the hump of everyone registering and things quiet down a little bit. I do see this potentially going away. It's not clear yet when that'll happen. Hopefully it'll be sooner than later.
Perfect. That was really good background on why things are so bottlenecked and what we do when we say you can skip the line with Telgorithm. So to answer this question, there isn't really a shortcut for specific like messaging use case campaigns, right? Like regardless of the content, you're just sort of
That's
having to go.
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. There's no shortcut. And we'll go back to the question here, but we'll deal with sole proprietor because it could have been referring to that. And that's another important point that we should talk about as well. But go ahead.
No, that's the summary. I think that the question was around vetting specifically, so I think you answered it
Okay,
very well.
great. Awesome.
Perfect. Yeah, we can go into sole proprietor. It's super relevant. Tomorrow is when sole proprietor 1.0
Mhm.
actually is sunset by TCR. So let's dive into 2.0 and what's needed for that.
Yes. So I'll actually start this conversation with a term that some of you may have heard of called starter brand. And it was started by one provider and then used by some other providers. There is no such thing as a starter brand. Let me explain what I mean by this. And again, I'm not going to call out anyone by name, but I'm sure everyone that's attending here probably knows who I'm referring to. So when the campaign registry is, I will go back to it again, they created this new process of making sure everyone is vetted and verified to get onto this ecosystem to keep it a clean ecosystem. So there are different, as we mentioned before, part of creating a brand, which is an entity in the campaign registry. You have to provide your tax ID, the EIN number, and the legal name of the business. Now, some folk, but when the campaign registry first created the process, they started to look at the different types of entities that exist legally. So if folks that look it up, the IRS has an entity called sole proprietor. Sole proprietor is a business that's just getting started. I don't want to file a C Corp. I don't want to file an S Corp because of all the taxes involved. I'm not fully established. Maybe I'm selling apparel online and I just got myself a website on Wix. I want to just stay small for now. And so there is an entity type you can register with the IRS called sole proprietor. And therefore you don't really have tax ID. Tax ID doesn't really apply here. And so to support this use case, the campaign registry created a sole proprietor entity that did not require tax IDs in the registry. And because it was meant for a small business, the throughputs that were allocated were really low because the assumption was this is a small business, not a lot of throughput is needed to communicate with not a lot of customers. However, some providers said, hey, they got a lot of feedback. We don't want to get our tax ID, or getting tax IDs now from our brands is very annoying. And no doubtfully it probably is, not denying that. And some providers decided to take a shortcut here. Oh, wait, there's a path. We can go about registering legitimate brands that have filed C Corp, have filed S Corp, that are paying taxes, that do have EIN numbers from the IRS. And rather than having them get it, just have them all create this new thing called starter brand and started funneling all of that to create them under this sole prop on the background, sole prop 1.0. Hence, they created starter brands. And if you could validate this yourself, you go to the campaign registry, download the collateral, and look at sole prop limitations. You could actually match it up directly, some odd thing, to the limitation that the starter brand had, right? So this was essentially folks setting up a system, unfortunately, of taking advantage and making it seem like, oh, we got your back. Don't worry about these tax IDs. That's only if you want to send higher throughputs. You want to send lower throughputs, just register this way. And many, many folks, unfortunately, ended up registering incorrectly, improperly. There was no, one of the major providers that supported this said there wasn't a change that happened, and now they're sole proprietor 2.0. There was no change. You can look this up on the campaign registry website. It was very clearly defined from day one what a sole proprietor is, what the throughputs are, and what it's meant for. And it was also clarified what a brand is and who should be registering that way. I just want to make that clear. There was no change, and you could validate and verify that directly on the registry's website yourself. So but what ended up happening is because this was not the proper path, and folks were even exceeding the throughput limitations, what ended up happening is TCR and actually the network operators got wind of this. Folks are not properly registering. They're trying to take a shortcut path here. And then there was an announcement that was made by the registry, said that we are now going to sunset Sole Prop 1.0, and we're now creating Sole Prop 2.0. And what's interesting about this is you cannot remain on Sole Prop 1.0. So what I mean by this is, let's just say you were truly a sole proprietor and you registered as a sole proprietor, you are still going to be limited and blocked, basically as of tomorrow, I believe is the cutoff officially from TCR. One provider, that main provider, got an injunction till June 1st. So one provider got an injunction till June 1st because that's where the bulk of their traffic was. They ultimately said it wasn't the fault of the folks, they just got bad information from their provider. So they gave them till an extended time till June 1st. Industry-wide in general, the cutoff is April 20th. But the point is, if you were a sole proprietor, you would still have to re-register now under Sole Proprietor 2.0, or you will experience complete cut. They're literally going to sunset every single one of those campaign IDs by tomorrow in general in the industry. And if you're with this one major provider, you have an injunction until June 1st for that. That is something that they're doing. So that's one category. Now, all these brands that were true brands that registered on sole proprietors now have to actually go about registering with their tax ID the proper way now. And so to add, additional layer on top of the complexities of what's gone on recently, you now have this idea as well. But this idea of a starter brand, I just want to make sure that's clear, is not about this concept of, hey, I can avoid giving a tax ID because it's annoying to get that from brands and customers, and I can avoid doing that by going sole prop. That will no longer exist anymore, because to get on sole prop 2.0, you actually have to go through what's called an OTP process. You have to go through a provisioning process and set some specifics up on that side of things. And now you need to rate limit on there. You have to do some special reporting on there, which you're enforcing, where you actually have to get a manual approval to even get it enabled by TCR. So there's a much rigorous process for going about getting that set up. But again, I just want to clarify, starter brand, where it initially came from, is not the right path. There is a concept today, as I alluded to earlier, called low volume campaigns. So in the past, there was this concept, it was $10 per campaign, which gave you higher throughputs. There's now a concept for if I don't need as many throughputs, so I don't need as high throughput for my business. I'm new, I'm still a brand. I have a tax ID with the IRS. So I have to register as a brand, but I don't want to pay $10 a month. Now you can go to a low volume campaign or a low volume mixed use case campaign and pay $1.50 a month. But again, that is different than sole proprietor. Sole proprietor was always meant to be and should be only used, and is now being forced to be sole proprietor. And if you are not registered with the government entity as a sole proprietor, you need to then go and register as a brand.
Okay, perfect. We got a question that kind of relates to this in a sense, because I know what's required for sole proprietor, so maybe you can combine them together. But we have a question on deliverability. So someone asked, how can you have better delivery or deliverability on registered messages when some MNOs or carriers aren't providing DLRs on registered messaging?
Good question. So, well, where to begin on this one? So I'll try to break it. There's so many ways we can go about this. So first of all, let's start with DLR, another acronym. What is a DLR? Let's first clarify what that is, and then we can work our way back from there, hopefully. A DLR stands for a delivery receipt or deliverability receipt. So when you send a text message, let's just say we talk about this, one of the aggregators sends a message into T-Mobile's network. T-Mobile or Verizon will respond back. Now, they'll send a response back. That response is known as a DLR. A DLR could be an error. The DLR could be, hey, we got your request to send a message to one of our end users in the network, but we're not going to deliver it for X reason. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it even got delivered into the network at all. The DLR could be an error. The DLR could also be a success. It could be like, DLR, this message was successful. And there are different DLR codes that we actually built, but you could decipher on your own, whether it's SMPP, however you're built, or your provider has, to decipher what actually happened to the message. So a DLR, let's assume the message was delivered, right? You got a DLR, this message was actually delivered. That just means that the message was delivered into the carrier's network, right? But there's a lot of things that need to traverse also, and I'll talk about this because it makes sense in this subject, is called something called an HDLR, and people confuse those two. An HDLR stands for a handset delivery receipt, right? So if, Samantha, you have an iPhone, right? And you have T-Mobile or Verizon, just because Verizon received the text successfully, doesn't mean that you got it on your phone. Maybe you called up Verizon and said, I don't want text messaging on my phone. Maybe you have some software on your phone. Maybe you have a bug on your phone. Maybe your phone has a virus. This could be a whole list of reasons why Verizon may have successfully gotten your message, but that message never made it to your phone. So number one, let's break these two things down and why I brought up HDLR. HDLR, some carriers today support HDLRs. That means that not only did this make it into my network, Samantha actually received this message on her phone. There is no network operator today on long code messaging that guarantees HDLRs. If any provider has told you that, they are either misinformed or not telling you the right information. I repeat, there is no network operator in existence today that guarantees HDLRs. That means that the handset got deliverability on long code. There are factors that we use ourselves, and we built certain texts to try to detect and the likelihood that it was delivered. And sometimes you can get an HDLR. So there's a lot of gray area nuance there. But I want to go a little bit further back to DLR. DLR, you should always get. So I don't know if that question, now that there's clarity here, if you're referring to HDLR versus DLR. A DLR is simply a response back from the network operator that the aggregator sent the message to, that we got your call request to send a message to our network. Whether we're going to accept it or whether we're not, that's information and code will be in the DLR. If you have a message that's sent, let's just say you're using a provider and there's no DLR, that means there's some break between the provider that you're using and their aggregator. If you're directly integrated with an actual DCA, you will get a DLR for that message. If you don't, it means that, I mean, it's possible that you won't get a DLR there too, is if some reason their own platform failed and some bug happened where they couldn't even send the message at all to Verizon or T-Mobile. So then you wouldn't get a DLR at all. But in general, as long as the message is being sent to the network operator, right, successfully, it's peered, interconnected, you're going to get a DLR, either a success or a failure. So if you are using a provider and you're not getting any DLRs, there is some break that's occurring between the platform of the provider you're using and they're not getting even the attempted message send to the network operator. I would definitely bring that up to that particular provider and search, try to isolate where that break is. Is it between your APIs and your provider's APIs? If it's an aggregator, what's going on there? That should not be, that could be a one-off situation. If you're experiencing that, I would say, and for a tremendous amount of your traffic, there's likely some weird integration setup going on along the path prior to the DCA sending it to the network operator is the way I would address that. I would need more nuance and specifics there.
Sure. No, I think
to answer that person specifically. That's just a general answer.
No problem. That's a good start for sure. Do you want to speak to rate limit management that's needed for SolProp 2.0 as well as for best possible delivery?
Yes, one of our favorite topics here at Telgorithm and one of my favorite questions. So where to begin over here? So as I mentioned at the beginning of this Q&A, what are you paying for? What is A2P fundamentally? It is not about compliance. You have to be compliant to get in, but ultimately it's not about compliance. What you are purchasing when you purchase a brand and a campaign or a sole proprietor, you're purchasing throughputs, capabilities to be able to communicate to your consumers properly at certain throughput levels. That is what you are paying for. Make no mistake, you're not paying for compliance. You need to be compliant always. Nothing. And one other caveat I'll mention too, I think we get a lot of questions of, oh, wow, there's so many new compliance rules that have come out as of recently in general. Yes, the FCC did come out with something, but I'm talking fundamentals. Nothing has really changed recently, to be honest. It's just now they're being enforced. Big difference. It's not that all of a sudden they came up with a bunch of new rules right now. It's just that now they're enforcing them to make sure there's a clean path on A2P. So I just want to point that out on that side, but throughput limits, right? So you're purchasing throughputs. But here's the interesting part, and what a lot of folks are not aware of is that the throughputs that you have are decided by the network operators are different. So for instance, T-Mobile is a daily limit, right? They give you a daily limit for all the corresponding campaigns, use cases that exist under this brand, you get a daily limit. And by the way, those are messages just to T-Mobile, because AT&T is a whole other count. They do it per campaign, right, per minute. And then you have Verizon doing it per number per minute, UScellular per number per minute. If you mix these together, which unfortunately, most vendors are doing, you're going to run into some serious problems because one is you just purchased a higher amount of throughput. So if your provider is capping you to make sure you don't go over the limit, because you will get a blockage immediately if you go over that limit. If you're being capped, then you're not getting what you're paying for. You're paying X amount here to get this throughput. That's literally what you're paying for. And somebody's capping you on the back end because of queuing. And here's the crazier part on T-Mobile's case, daily limit. If you exceed that daily limit, I could tell you this is a fact, that message will drop. So let's just say you had 2,000 messages in a day to T-Mobile, because AT&T is a different count. So someone needs to track that for you. Very important. If you sent 2,001 messages, that 2001st message would drop. You would be charged for that message. You would have a disruption and you would be charged a carrier pass-through fee for that message, right? So here's the thing, who's tracking that for you, right? You're going to the registry, you should be going to the registry to buy your certificates to get your throughputs. You should then be taking those certificates and giving them to a provider that could support what you just purchased, right? So what would you or your provider need to know, right? You would need to know, because again, AT&T is different count. Well, if it's a daily allowance, when does the day start and end, right? Is it midnight to midnight? Is it rolling 24-hour period? You would need to know this information. Metro PCS is a subsidiary of T-Mobile. Is that included into the daily limit? And if your provider is not tracking any of this for you, you are guaranteed, I repeat, you are guaranteed to run into this problem. It's unfortunate many folks are still trying to figure out, the pieces just to get registered, only to become registered and find out their messages are being dropped because their throughput limits are being exceeded because they're assuming their provider is tracking it. Well, either they're either lifting the ceiling or not capping it. I will mention again, just a plug here for Telgorithm, we are the only vendor we're aware of in existence today that proactively at a campaign brand level tracks this for you and make sure you never exceed that limit. We've even built time routing recently to support that. We are the only vendor. We wish more would do it. We actually filed a provisional patent on it last year, but we still would like for more folks to be able to do that because fundamentally, what you are purchasing is throughputs. And if you have not built that tech, which is extremely complex to build, and your provider hasn't built that tech, you're going to spend all this money on registering and buying higher throughputs only to find out your messages are going to be dropping because your content was right, but no one was tracking your limits for you. So that's essentially in a nutshell. And when it comes to sole proprietor 2.0, that is actually now an absolute requirement, not even to in general, but just to get approved. The campaign registry will ask you, how are you tracking specifically, and you have to report on it, your T-Mobile rate limits to make sure you don't go above your limit there. And if you're not doing it and your provider is not doing it, you're not going to get approved for sole proprietor 2.0 at all. And so just pointing that out, because that's now mandatory for sole proprietor 2.0 from a TCR perspective. They won't even approve the campaign unless you or your provider you're using has some rate limiting system.
Awesome, Aaron. Thank you. Guys, unfortunately, we're already at time. That was so valuable, Aaron. Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to leave everyone with in this last minute?
Sure. There's a lot to discuss here. Obviously, one of the things I'll say with Telgorithm specifically is we like to provide a lot of education about fact and a lot of transparency. We come from being the customer ourselves, myself and my co-founders, and we've built tech. And we provide a lot of information about this. At the end of the day, it's very hard to do this on one Q&A session because there's so much information. But I will say is we've done a great job of automating this process for you, where you could streamline the entire process, get going, even start sending messages right away, unregistered temporarily until you get registered. We rate limit. We provide a lot of nuanced detail into your callbacks to make sure you're successful. We talk to all of our customers actually on day one to understand you, the needs of your business, and to set you up for success. If you have any question, look, if you're just curious, please reach out, talk to us. I know there's been some interesting questions brought up today. I try to answer them in general, but there could be nuances that I'm not aware of, and we'd be happy to run that. I'll mention one final thing. We have great relationships with all the main players in the ecosystem, including the campaign registry itself. I encourage everyone here to check my Q&A session out with the vice president of the campaign registry. We talk about some of this stuff, but at the end of the day, reach out to us. We're all ears, and we're looking to help the community in general as all of these changes come about. And I appreciate everyone for taking the time to join today and listen here.
Awesome. Aaron, we appreciate you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for everyone who joined us. We really appreciate it. Reach out to us anytime. We will get back to you with lots of info. And yeah, we can't wait to talk to you soon.